Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. And now, here are Bob and Richard.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Gambling with an Edge. I'm Bob Dancer.
And I'm Richard Munchkin.
Today we're talking to two people we are calling Thea and Theo, a brother and sister team that ran a blackjack team for many years. Thea and Theo, welcome to Gambling with an Edge.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Thank you.
I'll let you figure out who's Thea and who's Theo. How did you get started playing blackjack?
Well, we both practiced law for a number of years in New York. When Theo was in law school, he had an interest in blackjack and actually had mentioned it to me as a hobby. I, at that time, had no interest. Fast forward a number of years, and our parents enjoyed going to Atlantic City as hobbyists. They would play the little slots and this and that. I was visiting them for a weekend and took a drive down there with them. I lost about $200 at a blackjack table, quick, fast, and in a hurry. I did not even know basic strategy. I got a little pissed off. And when I returned to the family home, I remembered that Theo had said something about you could actually win at blackjack. And I thought, if I ever go back again to the casino with my parents, perhaps I would like to know. I began to look around on the shelves, and I found $1 Million Blackjack. I read it, and I thought, I didn't want to turn 30 in a law firm, and I'm going to turn 30 in a year. Maybe I should learn this stuff.
Uh-huh.
Wow. And so you started, and then did you get him involved?
Well,
No, it's
I
actually,
I called him and said, hey, did you ever really do much of this? And he said, yeah.
well, yeah, it was actually interesting. It's odd that I ended up as a gambler because I had made one trip to Atlantic City with my parents shortly after turning 21. I think I lost $20 on a slot machine, ate in the buffet, went home, and it made no impression on me. The next summer between college and law school, we had a cousin who worked at Doubleday, and she would always bring lots of books. One of them was Humble and Cooper, the world's greatest blackjack book. I happened to see that on the shelf. And
It was an overtitled book.
I know, right? No, yes, but it was fascinating to me. So it was, I think it was the high-op 2 count, whatever the count was. I learned that count, and I was a recreational player throughout law school, but not in any substance. I was playing a $5 unit and probably won a few $1,000s. And, at some point, I'd mentioned it to Thea, and at that point she was fully engaged in practicing law, and she agreed that it sounded kind of interesting, but it wasn't anything that she expressed any real interest in. So I was basically just a solo player. I would take a few trips to Las Vegas, very small stakes, but then and I was practicing law as well by this time when Thea just said she started to get interested. Then she mentioned, we should try to do this in a more serious way. And for me, it was great to have someone to play with, especially my sister. And so we started, making trips together and kind of building up from there. But it was great. Once she got interested, she really brought a tremendous amount of intelligence and passion. And we started building up from there.
Well, one story from those days when that was what I would consider maybe the first period of my blackjack playing career. Which, I'm now fully retired, but...
Are we talking about 1990, or is that about...
This would be mid-90s, 1995.
Mid-90s, okay.
Yeah, when we started working together, playing together.
Mid-90s. I mean, after all the ups and downs and the teams and all of that, if you ask either of us, what is the wipeout? We would both describe to you losing a couple of $1,000s in Atlantic City. Okay, when the sun came up on the boardwalk, we were out there. And we'd been playing as a hobby maybe about a year at that time. And my reaction was to look at Theo and say, hey, so what? We're going to get it back. I mean, we play well. We got unlucky. Look at this. We're out on the boardwalk. The sun is rising over the ocean. I mean, isn't this better than wearing a suit and going to work? And he turned to me and said, are you crazy? After this result, I can't afford to do this with a job.
So that was the first, what you thought was your first big loss. I mean, a loss that really affected you.
Yeah, well, we lost something like 20% of our bankroll. We
and
played half Kelly.
$2,000 or something?
Yeah, we started with a $10,000 bankroll. That's what we did. We played small. We played a $25 unit.
And did you know anything about bankroll management or?
We'd read from, $1 Million Blackjack. I actually learned the early surrender matrix numbers when I learned to count. I learned the Houston APC, and I believed what it said in that book about early surrender coming back any time now. Didn't bother to check, just learned them. When Theo and I got together to practice together, he said, What are you doing? And I said, well, I'm making a deviation. And he said, what planet deviation is that? Early surrender. I said, are you crazy? And we really did not have any casino background when we started.
So so at that point, you thought, you can't afford this.
Right. Well, we were both working in New York at the time, and we were making good money, but neither of us had a background in gambling, and the whole idea was the way we were brought up and everything was you work hard, save your money, and the idea that now, I worked harder all week, I came to this casino, and now, I've lost a couple of $1,000s, which given our later history is kind of almost laughable that we were that concerned about. At the time, it just seemed like, here I am, this, yeah. But it takes time to get inured to the swings and, the heat that comes with being that. And neither of us had that when we started, but we obviously continued with it. But it was, it was something of a shock. It was our first probably, 2 or 3 standard deviation negative swings that we had. We kind of made small profits up to that point.
We certainly could have started with them. We could have started playing much larger because I'd been practicing law on Wall Street for 5 years at that point. But the idea was I really wasn't a gambler.
That does not mean you've saved any money.
Well, we were brought up by, the way we were brought up, we did, and we, but we really weren't gamblers. That's not our background. And maybe some of that is the way the teams operated as well later. Aggregating a lot of action tends to smooth out your swings quite a lot.
Yeah, and I remember when betting green chips seemed like a lot, and then you get used to it. And when you bet black chips, that seems like a lot. And so, yeah, I think for everybody, you have to kind of work your way up and you get more comfortable with the swings over time. And
absolutely. And the math was evident from the book. I mean, the first time I read it, I don't have a particular math-oriented background, but reading $1 Million Blackjack, it was clear to me that this was real. This wasn't some person telling you, I know how you can beat such and such a game. This was actually going to work. But I didn't know if I could do it in the casino, and I didn't know if I would enjoy doing it in the casino. His stories were obviously fantastic about teams and acts and big players, and it captivated my imagination because until I was 30, I did the expected thing. I went to college, I went to law school, I went to work in a white shoe firm on Wall Street. I did Follow the Dead for a couple of weeks in the spring and the fall, but other than that...
That doesn't fit in with the white shoe.
Now, which corrupted you more, Blackjack or the Grateful Dead?
Well, the Grateful Dead was when I was in college, really. I mean, I would take 10 days to 2 weeks off and follow the band when they were on the East Coast in the fall and the spring, but I still went to class other than that and carried on with did the expected thing overall. Blackjack actually caused me to never go back to practice law, so I'd say Blackjack is bigger culprit.
All right, so now we're in the mid-90s. So your team is 2-person right now. You gradually expanded it. So in the mid to late 90s, how did this grow and what'd you do?
The first person that would subsequently join forces with us I'd encountered at the Mirage. It was a first trip in 96 after Thea and I had quit our jobs to play blackjack full time.
Well, wait, how did you get from I can't afford this to do this even with a job to let's quit our jobs?
We had taken a vacation in Las Vegas, and we wanted to make sure we doubled a bank, if I remember correctly, before we did it. So we went to Las Vegas, and we doubled our bank. So we had gone to Las Vegas. We're delighted with the games, and we had doubled our bank, which essentially that was what we needed to do to...
Well, for proof of concept is really how I would describe it. Because, I actually love the firm I worked at. And I love the work. I mean, it was very lucky. I did a lot of Latin American securities work in the early 90s, privatizations and that sort of thing. The people were incredible. I mean, fantastic. I did not dislike it in any way, shape, or form. I also didn't know that I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing it. And New York firms become very competitive as you attempt to make partner. And the last couple of years, if you are unsure whether it's where you should end up for the rest of your life, you're going to work awfully long hours and awfully hard to prove you can do it and that you want it. And it's like described as the pie eating contest where the prize is more pie. And it's, I just wasn't sure, So this was sowing a bit of wild oats. And when the proof of concept came up that, well, yes, we definitely can make money doing this. Now the question is how much, how big, for how long, in what way? Will we bet purple chips, or will we just bet green chips? But we had a proof of concept, and I had just turned 30, and I thought it was time for a break. So we discussed it, and we actually gave notice on the same day. We went in, talked to each other. One of my mentors at the firm actually assumed I was going to work at an investment bank because that is what many people who left. I mean, the structure of a law firm in New York at that time was an entering class might be 70 people of lawyers. And through gradual attrition, at the end, maybe they'd make, anywhere between 0 and 5 partners at the end. So many of my classmates had already moved on. It's a terrific experience, even if you know you want to go home and practice law in Iowa, for example, or go into government or whatever else. And one thing many people did was work at investment banks. And so the partner to whom I gave my notice assumed I was going to an investment bank. And I said, no. He said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, nothing. He was really surprised by that and said, well, why don't we make it a leave for a year then? And I said, okay, that's fine. I mean, as it happened, I didn't go back. The blackjack gods did smile on us.
But that's another thing that I think is important to note is that, like myself, I still have my law degree, still have my experience that if gambling didn't work, I knew the one way or the other I could go back to making a living as an attorney, maybe depending how long it had been, maybe not to such a good firm in New York City or whatever, but one way or the other I would be okay. But my recollection, we were both extremely excited to do it, to just get out there and do it, to try to, live some of these stories that we had been reading, most prominently in Ken Houston's books, but others as well. So, it was kind of a relief to have doubled the bank and say now, because we played as much as we could, but both practicing law full time, it was, we didn't get to play as much as we wanted. But I do remember, we would sometimes leave work early if we could, and we'd ride. There was an Academy bus from the Port Authority to Atlantic City, and we'd ride the Academy bus down to Atlantic City and play our little $25 unit, happy as clams. I remember all over, and it was, that's the kind of passion we brought to it. We literally couldn't wait to do it as much as we could. We were just, it's.
A funny story from those days.
Did they give you rolls and nickels when you?
Yes, they did. Yes. Yeah, we would arrive at the Taj Mahal, I believe, for the most part, and I think we actually made, was it $5 a piece from, what you could cash in your
bus?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We made about $5 or $10 for riding the bus, and then would.
A funny story from those days playing in Atlantic City. I was playing at a table in a place that I'll affectionately call the Bowl, and I was counting a shoe, and I noticed that there was a guy standing behind me, wearing biker attire and with a wallet attached by a chain and all of that, watching the table. And it made me slightly nervous, but I thought, look, I'm in a casino. I'm sure it's going to be fine. So the count went up and I started betting. And by the time the count had reached a true 5 or so, suddenly this guy decided to join the table, and put down 2 hands. So I looked at him and I gave him my best smile and I said, hey, would you mind waiting till the end of the shoe? I'm just getting on a roll here. At which point he said, I'm coming from the same place you are, honey. And I said, oh my God, this guy is counting. I never would have thought, never would have imagined. He was wonging, and he was. So at the end of the shoe, we both wandered away from the table, and he introduced himself. And it was like he had played on one of Ken Houston's last teams, I think is what he told us, and it was true. And we struck up a kind of a friendship with him, but it was like magic. It was like someone coming to life from the pages of a book. That was the first person I ever met in a casino who was doing what we did.
Almost everybody has those kind of stories where you're out playing and suddenly a guy, you realize there's another counter in the world. And back then it was more rare. I mean, especially when I started, it was really rare. But yeah, there is something kind of magical about that. You end up trying to talk in the bathroom or something, to...
Yeah, well, I said you have to meet my brother because you're, this is why we're here. You were one of the... Because he introduced himself in that way. He made a reference to the character in the book that he was. Because he'd asked me, what count do you play? And I said, Houston APC, which is what we did play at that time. And he said, really, me too. I am blah from the book. And I said, oh my God, it was pretty... It was pretty fun. We had a lot of fun back then. We got snowed in. Do you recall that? I forget
Blizzard
which year
of
it was
'96. The blizzard, yeah.
Yeah, we were playing just on the weekends, and we'd gone down for the weekend, and in exercise of good judgment, we probably should have left because of the possibility of being snowed in. But I guess we didn't really think it could happen.
How bad can it be? It's a restaurant. It's a hotel. You can...
Well, the problem was explaining to white shoe partners at a law firm why I'm not turning up for work on Monday, although I guess there was a picture on the front page of the New York Times of people cross-country skiing down Fifth Avenue. So nobody was really going to work that day. It was that bad. But it was actually kind of awful, if I remember correctly, because not all the restaurants, very few were open. It was like the buffet only. They had some of the employees had been snowed in, or they kept them there by force. I don't know. I mean, they also didn't go home. It was actually kind of a fun atmosphere.
It was a very fun atmosphere. Remember the hotel we were staying at, the
Bowl.
This was close to the bowl, but one of the guys who worked in the hotel referred to the people staying in the hotel as the patients. And there was a restaurant there called, I believe it was the Garden Inn, that we started calling it the garbage room, garden room, or the garbage room.
That doesn't narrow it down as to which place it was.
Well, it was being trapped. It was like us and a lot of other patrons were kind of trapped. And to an extent, there was that carnival or party atmosphere you'd expect, with a bunch of adults trapped in a place with plenty of booze, adequate food, and games to play. But it also was kind of disturbing because none of us could actually get out and go back to our normal lives. So, but yeah, it was fun.
Okay, so we were talking about how your team gradually grew before Richard so rudely interrupted you. So now you were saying,
met a guy at the barrage.
So now Thea and I have quit our jobs. We did one successful trip to AC after that, and we couldn't wait to make our first trip to Vegas as full-time players. And so we were playing a great double deck game at the Mirage, and I noticed, I would think I was going about from 25 or 50 to 500, and I noticed the gentleman a few seats down who was playing with his wife, although she wasn't playing, she was just watching, and she was pregnant at the time, which I noticed. He was doing the exact same thing I was. And so the session went on. Of course, I mentioned to Thea afterwards that I was excited. I'd encountered another really good player, but then neither of us got each other's phone number or anything, so no contact was made. 6 months later, I ran into the same gentleman at a different casino on the Strip, and at this point, after the session, he said, "Listen, let's get something to eat." So at that point, I went to Thea, and we met, which would be one of our best and longest lasting teammates.
Yeah, one of the things I'd say is we were really lucky in the group of people who became principals with us in the teams, and also all the members. We were extraordinarily lucky in working with some really fantastically creative and talented people. And this guy certainly is the best of the best. He's incredible. He deserves a lot of credit for the team coming together because just like that, let's get something to eat. He had a real talent for bringing people together, and it was just enormously fun to be around, and obviously a very talented advantage player as well. So,
and a similar background, Theo, to us.
Yeah, he actually had worked on Wall Street himself for a brief period, and then decided there was
become
other
a
things he'd rather
refugee
do.
from the financial thing.
Yeah. So at that point, we didn't really play, as we would call it back then, joint bank. It's a leap of faith to start doing that. And obviously playing with a sibling is different. We began to travel together just because we really enjoyed each other's company, but neither of us, we didn't really need to combine bankroll at that time for any reason. We could all play the stakes we were playing. We were starting to play bigger, of course, as we got more experience. As one comment I would make to people starting in Blackjack is that when you start on your own, you typically, sometimes maybe it's because of a lack of capital, or it might be just being able to understand that you should go slow in the beginning and develop your skills. But you tend to bet bigger as you have more experience and understand how to handle yourself in a casino, present yourself better in a casino. One of the things that was always a challenge with team play was bringing in new people who had never played blackjack in a casino before and checking them out to a technical standard. But it was also very important to make sure they were well enough versed in how to behave in a casino to look natural, even betting black chips, even if they were flat betting as spotters betting black chips. Because when I learned to play, practicing before we even launched our first bank, and again, I was close to 30 years old and an attorney in New York. I was playing $5 a hand in some casino in Atlantic City in an 8-deck game, and I was very excited when the count first indicated I could raise my bet. And I bet $15. And my heart was pounding, and I was absolutely certain that the dealer knew exactly what I was doing. I remember this to this day. It was practice, but my sense of it as a first-time player was, what I'm doing is so obvious. Why else would I raise my bet? Obviously, I must be counting. Now, fast forward 6 months, and I'd bet 100 and then 2,000 on a double deck game without giving it a second thought, with full endorsement from the pit. So you just have to grow into it. So we didn't need to share bankroll at that time, and we didn't for a while.
One of my favorite sayings is that it's easy to learn to count cards. It's hard to learn how to get away with it.
Yes.
And that casino comportment is so important. And yeah, you're right. I mean, they need to get hours under their belt. And plus they need the hours of, losing for 100 hours or whatever, so they understand that some of these swings are going to be enormous. But I'm sure people listening to this are mind boggled by the idea that you could go from 100 to 2,000 on a double deck. Nowadays, you would be gone in like 10 minutes or something.
Well, I think the world has changed enormously.
Yes.
I mean, this is before the era of what I'll refer to as the big team. Obviously, we're both happy to be here and talking to you, although there are some things we can't address because we need to protect the privacy of all the people involved. It's really all of their stories. So we're going to just talk about our personal experiences more than others. But this is from the period of time we were playing ourselves prior to the big team. And this was the late 90s. And I think the use of computer software by casinos to analyze players and their play was not as widespread as it is now. And if you're going to tell me, basically, by coming down as a shift manager that you're going to evaluate my play right now, I will show you what you need to see. I will try to the best of my ability to do that. And, for example, if you're playing a double deck game and you're coming off the top somewhere in the middle of your range or lower to middle end of your range, and you beat the dealer's 20 with a blackjack, and you are chatting with the shift manager at the time, there's only one thing to do, and that's stack it up.
Right.
And after that has happened, and you've had a pleasant conversation, and you've been given the card, if you need anything, let me know. Next time you do that, it's because, 10 little points came out. But the concept that you are random has been established. So that's kind of what I would say, is that it certainly wasn't that era, and that style of play certainly did not involve the no-cover approach that we were well known for later.
Right. But now I also want to touch on, how do you think being a woman affected your play? Do you think you were given more leeway? Do you think...
I think it had blessings and curses that associated with it. For sure, during the era when I was playing myself and spreading myself, it was, I think, an advantage because I didn't travel alone. I traveled with teammates, playing partners, and we would typically be in the same casino at the same time, although we would not necessarily at the same table. So it solved the question of, what are you doing here alone? Betting a lot of money, which seems odd if you're a woman. In terms of seeming innocuous, I mean, it's obviously... there is chauvinism in the world, and men often underestimate women. And I remember one conversation in particular, in terms of laying cover at a particular casino in Vegas playing double deck. I felt that a particular pit boss had been noting my play, and I wanted to persuade him, give him something to hang his hat on, so to speak, if he wanted to believe I was good action. So I had a blackjack, and the dealer had an ace up, and the dealer offered me even money. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, even money for your blackjack." I said, "Well, I'm from New York. I mean, I don't really understand that. Like, can I just have insurance?" I said, "Well, honey, it's even money is the same thing." I said, "I don't know. Could he explain to me?" So he comes over, and, after about 5 minutes of trying to explain to me that even money was the same as blackjack, and my expressing massive confusion about this and really insisting that I just put my insurance bet up, please, he turned to the dealer, said, "Give her even money," and walked away. And he didn't take another look at my table for the rest of the session. I mean, understandably enough, I would have run away screaming too.
Yeah. In my book, I interviewed Kat Holbert, who started out as a blackjack player, and she said that in the beginning she got an awful lot of leeway, but the downside was, once they did know who she was, they tended not to forget who she was.
I think that's true. I would agree with that 100%. That once you become notorious or known, there are just fewer women. It's a smaller pool to choose from in terms of being identified. So I think that's definitely true. But later on, our play style tended to evolve as well. And that when we began working with big players, I wasn't the focus of attention anymore as a counter. And that also was very easy to blend in as a woman.
I think when we were playing in our early days, we would often go as husband and wife. Now, of course, which was, I think, a perfect... it helped me, I feel, a great deal as well, because, of course, I was here with my wife. It's something the casino sees thousands of times. There's no cause for concern. So I think it had some benefits for me as well, because at the time I was relatively young, a relatively young person by himself in the casino, betting a lot of money, I think can arouse attention. But a guy with his wife, that looks perfectly reasonable, perfectly normal. And some of the stuff we would do, egg each other on, I might come over, or she might come over. "Oh, why are you losing so much money? Why are you betting so much? Oh, leave me alone." They've seen it 1,000 times, and I think it really helped both of us.
There's a story
down.
I've got to tell. I just can't. We were debating how much was reasonable what kinds of stories were reasonable to tell. Obviously, things from the big team era, we have to be very careful to respect everyone's privacy, but this is just our story. I mean, there was a time we were playing at a casino in the South, and they had a really nice little double deck and 4-deck game. And Theo was playing on the 4-deck game. I was playing on the double deck game. And we were playing in their high limit pit. They had a 100 to 2,000 sort of maximum, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
And I had a really hot count in my double deck, and I ran out of chips. And so I saw he had stacks, including a bunch of orange chips. I said, hold on, don't do anything, just wait. So I ran over and said, give me some of those chips. So he, of course, knows exactly what's going on. He's like, wait a minute, don't take those orange ones. I said, why not? Like, give me them, I want them. He said, well, okay, you can have them, but don't bet them. And at which point the pit boss, who was watching us play, said, why not? The female pit boss, why not? You did. At which point, okay. From her perspective, I was striking one for women's lib. I was betting just like he did. I wasn't sitting there quietly betting quarters while he had all the fun, right? Now, again, with male pit bosses, it was the opposite. They were like, oh my God, this poor guy with this out of control wife, But either way, they were thinking about a lot of things, but it wasn't that we were advantage players.
Right. You don't care what they think as long as they don't think you're smart. I think it was that in Ken Houston's book, or it's one of the truest things. Anything that sets them down a path other than is this an advantage player is exactly what you want. And a husband and wife quarreling, I think it's just,
very natural.
It was a good thing.
Now, did you have any? So you're up to betting 2,000 a hand. I mean, did you have any bad barrings at this point?
Well, we were playing the first time I'm aware of that we were backed off from a casino was actually. It was before we started doing team play, right? I mean, we were, it was just the two of us. It was in the Midwest, right? Mm-hmm. I think you remember. So, no, nothing unpleasant at all. There was one place in the Midwest, a boat, I think they didn't know. The first place I was ever asked not to play blackjack was a boat in the Midwest. And I think that's all that happened. They said, could you please not play blackjack anymore? And the first time we ever got barred was, really doing call-ins. Okay, and that's another thing. I think it's, we lived it ourselves, but our teams did later. That's what we did. When we started doing call-ins, we took it straight to them, never stopped. And that is how we got flyered. Backed off, flyered. That was the first.
Then there was a tremendous amount of heat quickly. But at that point, too, even if they suspected, I think they were more likely to maybe shuffle a bit early. Again, there was during this period of time playing the two of us and then with our friend, there was nothing nasty, Yeah.
Well, that's good.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Of course. Now we're talking. This was 20 years ago. Now it's hard to believe, but
all right. We're talking to Theo and Thea. We're going to take a brief break for some commercials, and then we're going to come back and find out what happened when they grew to a bigger team and team play. South Point has more than 10,000 games, returning more than 99%. This is more than anyone else has. Through Thursday, May 24th, Monday through Thursday, you may earn 300 points between 3 a.m. and 11 p.m. and earn a spin at the kiosk. The prizes include 2,500 or 500 points. 2,500 or 5,000 points, worth $7.50 or $15 respectively. Free buffet, $10 food, $25 resort credit, food, or $15, $25, or $50 in free play. On Monday, May 28th, Memorial Day, they'll be holding a $32,000 hot seat giveaway between 8 a.m. and midnight. Every 3 minutes, one lucky player will receive $100 in free slot play. All you need to do to be eligible is to be playing any machine at a rate of at least $1 coin in the previous minute. At videopoker.com is the best place to play lots of games. If you sign up for the gold membership, $8.95 a month or $79.95 a year, this allows you to get corrections on most of the games. The game of the week is Face Card Frenzy. You may play this game anywhere from 6 coins per line to 10 coins per line, with the odds increasing as you increase your bet. In this game, full houses and quads, including jacks, queens, kings, and aces, return a lot more than usual. To make the math work, all the pay schedule categories are bumped up, meaning you lead an entirely new strategy to play this game. In addition, no games in this variety were released returning more than 99%, so it will take one hell of a promotion to make this game worth learning. We are back to Theo and Thea. before we get into your bigger team, any stories again from when you were, say, less than 10 people that you find worth telling, or we'll just get on to the bigger group?
Well, actually, we had played after leaving our legal jobs. We played for about a year in this sort of individual manner, not using team play concepts at all. We traveled. My brother and I, of course, were playing joint bank. We traveled with this fellow traveler of sorts. And we did eventually start playing joint bank with him as a variance reduction measure, mainly, I suppose, for him because he was solo. Where, the biggest improvement obviously comes from adding one other player that you share results with. But for us, it was nice, too. So we played a bit of joint bank together. But at that point, like I said, he really was sort of a master at bringing people together. And he had played for a year or two, I guess, before we started playing, maybe even longer. He had met some other people. And of course, we had read $1 Million Blackjack, and the idea of doing team play at some point in our career was something we were interested in. And he said, I know a couple guys that might be good. So why don't we try this? And we did. And, it's not that easy to come back from it to the extent that suddenly a couple of things happen. I mean, rather than having to lay cover and such when you spread, there's something beautiful about $5 when you have the edge and some unit when we do.
The edge.
And of course, it brings new challenges too. It's interesting working with different people. The technical part of Blackjack is relatively straightforward, at least for straight counting games. It's quite easy to learn. It requires practice, but it's accessible. And once you know it, you know it. The act is, some people could say it's endlessly interesting, but once you've mastered the principles of how to blend in and appear like you belong there, it all gets a little bit old. But when you're dealing with new challenges, which is adding new people and coordinating a group and a different style of play, it becomes more interesting. So once we tried it, we liked it, as they say, and we
had run lucky in the beginning too.
Our first trip was the Blackjack gods clearly wanted us to do call and play because we won 3 times EV, and that despite understanding that it was 3 times EV, the feeling of it. Phrase I'm known for, CIF versus EV is, it's hard to beat that.
CIF?
Cash in fist.
Okay.
And the first time we actually had a cross-pollination of sorts with another team that was operating around that time, we used to joke about it because they were very based on calculations. And we were all about technically correct play as well. But we also were more focused on winning and winning today. And so we used to joke about CIF versus C.
Yeah. So just to kind of catch up people listening that aren't up to speed here. First of all, big player call-in consists of having small bettors at the table who do the counting and then call a big player in to make the big bets once the count has gone up. And I don't want to even get into CE, but it's the certainty equivalent, and you can look it up on Wikipedia and there were endless hours and hours and hours of discussion about the CE on the MIT team.
Yes.
Yeah.
But we actually played
I have
for 3 years.
One question, though, before we move on. It seems to me there's a really important point in every Blackjack player's career, and that is the 150-plus hour losing streak. Had you had one of those yet?
When we played together, we really hadn't. We certainly had swings, but we did not have an extended period of time where we actually lost. I mean, I can say that my Blackjack bankroll grew from the original, my half of the 10,000 that we started with. We never really did have a negative swing of that sort. I mean, I guess we always played a strong game. We were always pretty aggressive and played limited cover. Even from our perspective, playing double deck, of course, you have to play some cover. But we were aggressive and played a game with a strong percent edge, and we were lucky in that way. When we started doing team play, we certainly had some very big losing trips, especially because we really didn't know what we were doing in the beginning. And you just make mistakes, lots of them.
Like what kind of mistakes?
Well,
actually, one that comes to mind for me, because I also played with a big team at one point. If you don't have really good communication, you can have 3 or 4 different plays going on at the same time, and they all lose, and suddenly you've lost a ton without realizing it.
Yeah, well, for sure, that sounds horrible. And, that's the things we experienced when we started were not exactly mistakes of that sort. I mean, the choice of playing partners or teammates is important. And having a unified approach to discipline strategy and discipline across the board is very important.
So you'd spank players when they make mistakes? Is that kind of discipline?
No, no one ever called me mistress. I'm not really speaking about technical mistakes so much as, for example, adhering to a bankroll, a betting strategy, and not advancing it on the fly. Like, again, we didn't have an enormous amount of gamble. Some of the people we played with early in our team play did, and our agreements were not clear enough
about how much they should be betting and
yes, that sort of thing, and standards for technical proficiency as well. I mean, it's people have different standards for how prepared they feel they need to be in order to play, and the best way to know if someone's prepared to play is to audit or to check them out. And in the beginning, we didn't necessarily do that, and there was a range, with both big players being their job is simpler. They need to play basic and take signals as to how much to bet, and counters. But especially under pressure, under live conditions, someone who doesn't play often, just plays on, weekends, may or may not be capable of keeping a perfectly accurate count. So those are the kind of mistakes I'm referring to from those early period, which wasn't very short, by the way. This period under 10 people lasted for really until late 1999. When I first met Richard, for example, at the the Blackjack ball back then, that was kind of the turning point where we were, as what we considered the small team, which was, had become well enough known that we were considering it might be better for us to spend less time actually sitting at the table counting cards for BPs and more time training other people to do that.
And I think a lot of the techniques that the bigger team was very well known for example, really comprehensive training, extremely difficult checkouts, in-casino work, all of that grew out of Thea and the other early team members' actual real-world experiences, losing money, seeing mistakes being made, and just coming to this realization that to have a bigger group, we just have to do these things. Like, initially with the really core group, we, as Theo would put it, we just kind of, throw the money on the bed. Total confidence in the other people's ability to play, how serious they were taking it, that it's not, but as we started to grow, then we had we made these mistakes by not having these comprehensive procedures, and we learned to do it. But it came out of our own personal experiences, because when we were still practicing law, Thea lived very close to the law offices that I worked at. So I used to stop by her apartment at 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and we deal cards to each other for 2 hours before work. That's how committed we were to zero mistakes. Because all you're doing in counting is swinging the edge from 1 or 2 points in their favor to 1 or 2 points in your favor. And, mistakes can be deadly. And when we expanded the group initially, we learned that the hard way.
Yeah. I mean, to clarify, like even in the beginning, we even in the throw the money on your bed era, so to speak, when it was just a few people, and ideas like Blackjack bank structure for playing joint bank didn't really occur to us at that point. And we just said, well, there's 4 of us, so we're going to play X stakes. It means each person's share is X, right? We'll all play the same amount of time. Everybody brings their share of the bankroll we think is necessary, the percentage of the total bank that we think is necessary for a trip of this duration, and that's it. And at the end, since we'll all play all the time, we'll just throw it on the bed and split it up. Even during that era, where, obviously incentives are not an issue at that point because everyone is, there is no player-investor divide, so to speak.
It's funny because in my own career, I went full circle back to that, right? And now I'm also retired, but in the last years when I played, I would go for a weekend with 2 or 3 people, and at the end of the weekend, we'd throw it on the bed and chop it up equally, and no long-term commitment, no target, no, just go play and chop it up, and we're done.
Yes, it is simple, and that's even in that era though, because we were unfamiliar with the sort of heat we would get, and the fact that it was a sort of a false sense of immunity, as it were, by just betting, but I mean, the casinos were fairly efficient at figuring out who was part of the group at that point, and we hadn't developed any real appreciation of how one might minimize the chances of that happening for the counters. I mean, the big players, of course, are out there front and center, and they always will be. But, at that time, I mean, I didn't actually act as big player, except I'd never really thought the casinos would take call-in play from a woman. I thought it would be difficult. I know there are some women who've done it, but it wasn't something I felt comfortable doing. So I never played that role, but all the rest of us did in different parts of the country, at different places, for literally years. There was a 3-year period where we would sometimes recruit new VPs, but we also would just play ourselves. And the group that settled down was the group I think Theo was referring to, where we had this complete confidence. In the beginning, we played with a variety of people. Not all of them did take it quite as seriously.
All right. Now, when you were starting this bigger team, did it help with any cross-pollination from other successful blackjack teams?
Yeah, we were very fortunate in a lot of ways. Some of the people we met who became the other principals in the big team, what I'll refer to as the big team, were just fantastic. And we had some cross-pollination. I mean, if you're playing there was a call-in play we did in the Midwest where there was another group was there, another team was there, and what we call the small team was there. And 2 counters happened to be at the same table. And the player from the other team commented to our player, "Wow, where did you get that guy? He's amazing. The VP had a good act." And that was something we emphasized even back then, because it's what we had learned playing ourselves, and we bet the money ourselves, that it is important to present well. It can take you far. So that's how we first made contact with the other group, was actually that very random occurrence. They exchanged phone numbers, were in touch. And, if you can fast forward a few years from that, we'd had various contacts, sharing some information from time to time about games and that sort of thing. But around the time, which is the end of 1999, that we decided it might be better, we wanted to expand the group and maybe change our roles slightly from primarily playing in the casino to training and backing a group of players. That is where we had a lot of cross-pollination with another large team that was operating at the time.
So I wanted to get to this training in the checkouts, because people talk about the MIT team supposedly having these rigorous checkouts that were so difficult. And you're saying that it sounds like your checkouts were very difficult, but I remember people saying to me that went from, the MIT team to your team.
Absolutely.
That basically they were just sort of welcomed and said, "Oh, well, if you checked out for them, then you're kind of okay. You're okay."
We owe the MIT team a debts in many ways. There's many fine players and people I consider great personal friends. I met, they started there and ended up playing with us. And the checkout procedures for sure. Because like I said, when we first started, we were to work with a group of people. We did not have anything like checkout procedures. We made a fair amount of mistakes in terms of assuming. And the way our approach at that time was the group just settled out in a natural way to full-time professional players. And many of the part-time players we'd worked with, it just wasn't a good fit. And it's taking nothing away from them. They're fantastically smart, talented people. But to the extent that they were still on Wall Street, blackjack was a hobby for them that they'd play for the weekend. It was different for us because we were full-time. So we essentially drifted apart. And the people we were playing with were people we did not need to check out, because they were experienced equally with us. They'd played as long as we had. We all were full-time professionals, and this is how we made a living. We could say, "Did you warm up?" And the answer being yes was good enough. So we didn't really have any of that during the small team era. When we began to cross-pollinate, we began to hear these things, like, payoff errors. And we'd say, "Well, what do you mean?" And they said, "Well, what if people don't catch payoff errors? You have to have that as part of your checkout. The real teams do." We said, "Well, okay, I guess we want to be a real team. I guess we should." I thought it was a fantastic idea, of course. I took it for granted that I don't believe I missed too many of them in my life playing in the casino. But of course, when you think about it, if you're new to blackjack, you can, and it can cost you thousands of dollars. So we incorporated them with a vengeance. And, the concept of a 5-shoe, I think, came from the idea that it should be a 5-shoe initial checkout.
And the payoff errors also help because you're forced to essentially juggle something as well. You have to keep the running count, convert to the true count, call the correct bet, and catch all the payoff errors. In addition to saving money at the table, it's kind of over giving, stressing, like if you need a bridge to be able to support 10,000 pounds, build it to support 15,000 pounds. That
so
was.
Can we talk about what the checkout process was?
Sure.
So what was it?
Well, we if we're speaking now, I assume of the big team era.
Yeah, the big
So
team.
we'll speak in general, general terms about this. Because the team primarily did call-ins, it was possible to join the team at a number of levels. You could join the team as a big player, which meant you needed to learn to play perfect basic strategy and to respond appropriately to signals about how much you should bet.
You didn't give them an amended basic strategy that was like +1 or plus something?
No, we didn't.
So they're hitting 16 against a 10?
Unless they were given a signal not to, yeah. I mean, we played, the rules back then were obviously very good. They were very favorable. Conditions were enormously different than they are now for blackjack in Las Vegas, for example. And if, for example, the specific case of 16 versus 10 didn't come up very much because they were surrendering in as a general matter. But we did not give them an amended strategy. We taught them straight basic, and we would signal. There were signals for deviations as well, if appropriate. And so they needed to learn basic. They needed to learn how to bet in response to signals, and they needed to learn how to respond to signals for play deviations, those we thought were important. And, we should tip our hat here to the wonderful, illustrious 18 and such, because they obviously weren't required to learn to respond to a full range, but rather those that were most important. It was possible to join as a spotter, which you would come and you had to learn to play basic strategy and keep a perfectly accurate running count with full distraction. And you could learn to play as a controller, which involved being able to do everything a spotter could do, but also convert to true and signal smoothly and accurately to a BP at the table.
Wait, you said you used the term "to full distraction." So, did you have something that you did during these checkouts to
sure.
distract?
Someone not checking out might just make conversation, pretend to be a cocktail waitress or a pit boss, ask for ID, repeatedly ask for a drink. The person's phone might ring. If they happen to have their phone with them at the table, people pick that up pretty quickly. They should turn their phone off before the checkout, right? So more or less all manner of distraction.
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. It became a bit of an art form. I mean, I'm not going to say it was like hazing, because it wasn't. The intent was never to freak anyone out, but the idea was you're joining a bit of a fraternity. And, being confident in your own skills. Again, I never will forget being in the casino with my heart pounding, betting from $5 to $15, sure that everyone knew what I was doing and wondering if my count was accurate. And I thought, okay, at this point, these people are not going to have the opportunity to bet $25 and double a bank playing a $25 unit that I did. They are going to be, when they check out, they're going to be playing black chips, calling in a BP who's going to be betting yellow chips. And they need to be confident in their abilities, and their teammates need to be confident in their abilities. And so I like to believe the environment was very supportive, but very tough. And the distractions were, sure, kind of extreme. I mean, all these things would happen, and sometimes more, but in a sort of joking and friendly way. I mean, we worked with an amazing group of people. It wasn't just the two of us. Okay. The group that managed the big team was 6-7 people. And
well, it takes a lot of people to manage a big team. I mean,
it does. And, we had some amount of specialization, and the guy who as things developed, became primarily responsible for training was absolutely fantastic. And I think genuinely loved what he was doing. It was very tough, very fair, and a great teacher. So for sure, I know I've listened to some of the interviews you've done with some of my former teammates. And, I think the way they described it, really made me smile, because I remembered the environment. And I think the impression they gave you guys, which is true, was that it was very tough. And if you were totally new to the group, kind of scary, but that ultimately when they got in the casino, they were very happy that it had been approached that way.
So every team runs into this issue of how do you compensate the people, right? You started out, in a great manner where you throw it on the bed and chop it up. But when you have a big team, you can't do that. And I'm sure your process evolved, but how did you end up figuring out how to compensate people?
In the small team era, which, sort of prior to 1999, we did experiment with having non-investing or smaller investing members from time to time. And that is where we first had to address the issue. If everyone isn't putting up the same amount of bankroll and playing the same amount of time, again, there is no issue. And we really got it wrong in the beginning. I mean, to be honest, this is one of the mistakes we made. There were mistakes in terms of not ensuring a consistent commitment level to the quality of play in the casino. But another mistake was not really understanding the effect of different durations of play or how to properly decide. If you're going to pay a long 40%, for example, as a player share, then you just can't pay 40% player share on trips that last for 50 counter hours, right? And you have to ask yourself, how are you going to deal with it? Are you just going to play till you win? Which me and some of my partners did. We there was a trip we called the Odyssey. It lasted for 6 weeks because we didn't want to come home stuck. But that's,
So we had this issue too where, and the problem is if you have players who aren't investors, they lose their motivation to play because...
Right. Well, one thing we tried to do was have... do things on a trip-by-trip basis. In other words, we try to get enough hours on that trip and then essentially do a bank break after that trip to kind of avoid that. But it's still, as Thea mentioned, we did have issues with some of our early non-investing players who wanted to get a high player share and would say, with all sincerity, well, look, if we're stuck, we'll just keep playing. So...
But will they?
The thing is, I think they would have, but we like the trip-by-trip mentality because the particular challenges I've had to face managing Blackjack have never included how to motivate a large group over a long period of time where their actual expectation, they may very well be too stuck to play. Okay. I think that's a real concept. And in a later project that I was involved in, that was a very different style from what I'd call the big team, was set up very differently. And there was no group activity in that way. So it does come up for individuals who are playing that they can become very stuck and having to deal with an individual and how to motivate them to make sure that there is enough upside for them, that it is worth it for them. Because I would never want to advise someone to continue to play when in reality, given that they have to win back X amount before they hit zero, it may very well be better for them to get a job. And obviously that's not good for the investors, right? But that's also not good for them. I never wanted to deal with that problem. So we always broke our banks on a strictly limited chronological basis. We'd go on a trip and we'd break win, lose, or draw at the end. And in the beginning, we felt we were playing long enough to get in the long run that we could simply break all the banks at whatever the desired long player share was. But we learned that wasn't correct. The non-investing members we began to play with, obviously changing things is difficult. Said, well, what do you mean? You're telling us now that you realize this is bad. Well, yeah, we realized it was bad because after having kept the books for a year, it turned out that investment return that year in the late 90s paid exactly zero. Okay. Which is, again, like I said, when we spoke at one other time, if you take the attitude that bringing the capital to the party is like bringing a paintbrush and you should split up the money with your teammates based simply on the time spent, it's fine. We didn't cry any bitter tears over it, but we did realize we wanted to compensate providing capital to some extent.
It's not a risk-free endeavor.
That year.
Right, sure.
The players who had experienced that other system didn't like it, the change, and said, well, look, if we want to keep playing and you guys are going to say when it's time to stop playing, even if we're stuck, why should we not, we don't like this. And so it was hard with a small group. The large team, one of the reasons for the team growing so large later was that it really more or less obviated these problems. Because if you were aggregating, hundreds of counter hours,
right.
in a week-long period, there's really no need. That is far enough in the long run. The banks are going to split at very close to a long percentage that is agreed. And if you lose, it's rare, and you just take your lumps as an investor. Okay, you don't expect people to stay and dig it out.
Okay, so we were talking about investors and getting confiscated and the players.
Yes, and that was a mistake we made in organizing the banks in the beginning. So right. That was something we really didn't fully appreciate. We knew we didn't want to contend with a long-term bank where people had to make time commitments that they might not want to make, where we would have to schedule very far in advance. We left Wall Street jobs partly to have freedom. And it's one thing to commit to play blackjack for a couple of weeks with a group of people. It's another to commit to a bank that might last for 6 months or more. So we didn't fully appreciate what that meant for when there was not a very large group in terms of not getting in the long run on each play. and the effect that the inevitable losing banks will have on the investor's return at the end of the year. So we did have a year where the investor return was exactly zero, which again, like I was saying, is not necessarily all bad depending on the agreements. But that also it's difficult to incentivize people to provide capital in that situation because everyone would prefer not to take the risk. So we realized we had to adjust the split percentage based on the duration of the play. For players who were used to that not being the case, they understandably didn't like it. And that actually provided
give them the opportunity to be an investor as well if they didn't like it, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Sure, but not everyone who we played with at all times was capable of being fully invested. Again, this is prior to the big team era. The trips might have had anywhere between 4 and 8 people on them. Playing a large unit to be a proportionate investor is actually a pretty substantial amount of capital required, and it is, of course, risky, and especially with smaller groups. Later, with the larger group, investment becomes less risky because with that many hours happening on each individual bank, they don't lose that often.
And because it is less risky, did you allocate less to the investors?
No, we didn't. But what we did was offer the opportunity to all members to be investors, not fully proportionally. We did have a
just
process.
Whatever they wanted to put in.
Well, there was a proportionate amount that each person could put in based on a combination of how much time they would play and their experience level and what additional work they did to help the team function. Because appearing on the trip and playing is obviously very important, but there was a lot of behind-the-scenes work that had to happen as well. So, we left an investor share the same, but investment opportunities were available to all the members in a scaled way.
Now, you didn't call it as such, but you implied there were some administrative costs to go on to each of the banks. You know, there was all this behind the scenes. So was that a particular cost for getting everything organized and stuff, or how did that work?
The way we did overhead expenses, they were shared among investors at the end of the year. For example, we had a CPA firm that did the accounting, and that expense had to be shared. Other than that, there wasn't a heavy burden of general administrative expenses. When people were in town playing...
Well, somebody had to make the plane reservation. Somebody had to make the hotel reservation.
Oh, those would go bank by bank. Any expenses like that simply went on the playing banks and were split as part of the way.
Well, you're talking about the expense of the airline ticket itself or the hotel or whatever.
With the exception of the airfare.
Yeah, airfare typically, we handled it a little differently on our team. I mean, the airfare for players was guaranteed if they were non-investors and if the bank lost.
In other words, yeah.
But I don't know how interesting that sort of detail actually is. But there were not a lot of what we would consider. I would break it down into overhead expenses that do not relate directly to play on a specific trip, and on expenses associated with play on a specific trip. And the expenses on the trip were simply deducted from the table win before we split the bank. So there was no special treatment for them. Overall, administrative expenses were really not a particularly significant factor. We simply split them at the end of the year. And that sort of thing might be pizza at a practice session in a particular town in between banks where people were recruiting new members and training them.
I was actually referring to the time the organizers, like you're training people. You are setting these things up. And you're doing a whole lot in the background. Is that just something you're doing out of the goodness of your heart?
We needed BPs. We wanted people to bet the money. And some of the players that needed more training would be, many of them didn't invest. And once we got the...
I think the question is probably a little bit different. The structure of the large team banks, there were two ways in which what I'd call the principal participants were compensated. One is that all members at a certain skill level were permitted to invest or welcome to invest.
Okay.
But as I said, not entirely proportionally. So if those who spent the most time organizing, had the most experience, etc., would be able to invest a multiple of the amount that would correspond to their number of days on site. So essentially, if that makes any sense to you, I don't know if it's...
Right, but you didn't have like a management fee off the top just for being the owners of the team? Or
we also did have a management share, which dealt with time very specifically for administrative matters like handling the accounting after each bank and preparing the team's tax filings, etc. So we did
maintaining the legal structure.
Yeah. I mean, we had LLCs and there was work associated with that. So we did have a management share as well that went to the team's managers for that activity. But much of the compensation was entirely risk-based in terms of investing in the very same banks. And that's the best way, from my perspective as a player, you can be sure that the managers are doing their very best to win because they're fully at risk.
I think Taleb wrote a book called Skin in the Game, Nicholas Taleb, and we all had a lot of skin in the game as the principals of the team. We had, always maxed our investment in that.
We have some good news and some bad news. The good news is this has been a delightful hour with Theo and Thea, and we've alluded about the big team, and we're not going to talk about it today because we ran out of time, which means you guys both have to come back, and which hopefully is in the very near future. And we'll continue with this. So thank you, Thea. Thank you, Theo.
Thanks to both of you. It's always a pleasure to see you, and we really enjoy your podcast. So
thank you, Richard. And
very fun.
In a blackjack sense, go out and hit a royal flush, everybody. Good day.